Hey guys, this is Miss Horner. Just wanted to check in with you and start going over and reviewing some of the packet that went home with you on that crazy hectic Monday when we were released from school. So let's start with chapter 22. Let's discuss our study guide answers, and we'll probably be moving forward into some test questions that I will submit and put on my website. Let's start with chapter 22. Number 1, how did President Abraham Lincoln's assassination and Andrew Johnson's ascension to the presidency affect the relationship between North and the South? Basically, it angered the Northerners. Remember, John Wilkes Booth that killed Lincoln was a Confederate sympathizer. So this totally split the regions, just like before the Civil War with all the sectionalism, and it opened the doors to revenge on the South. Number 2, how did President Abraham Lincoln's assassination and Andrew Johnson's ascension to the presidency affect African Americans? At this time, they are trying desperately to free the slaves. And so in order to kind of continue control over them, black codes or laws, very similar to our old slave codes in prior units we've talked about, they were issued in the South, and all they did was hold African Americans back and restrict them from having any kind of freedoms or rights. I think Lincoln probably would have been against the black codes. However, Andrew Johnson was a Southerner from the Carolinas and a Democrat, and he very much pushed for controlling the African Americans. So he wasn't as sympathetic as Lincoln was. All right, discussing our 3 plans for Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln's plan was referred to as the 10% plan. 10% of the voting population at that time had to pledge an oath of loyalty to the Union. Each one of the states wanting back into the Union had to create a new government with a new constitution, and within that new constitution, they had to abolish slavery. Once Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, President Andrew Johnson pretty much took over the same plan as Lincoln, except, like we said earlier, he wasn't as sympathetic towards the African Americans. So he didn't really believe that they should have full equal rights, and he allowed those black codes to be kind of enforced in the South, holding them very close to that same position in slavery they had had prior to the war. So just same plan, he just wasn't as sympathetic as far as giving them full rights as Abraham Lincoln was. And then we have Congress's plan, which was basically created by the radical Republicans. Basically, they wanted equal rights for freed slaves. So this gets 2 of our amendments. Here's the 13th Amendment, freeing them, and equal rights would be the 14th Amendment. So ratifying the 14th after that 13th was part of their plan. They also wanted to heavily occupy the South with military in order to make sure that 13th and 14th Amendment was kind of carried through. So in that Reconstruction Act, they had the South broken into 5 military districts with heavy troops, just military troops everywhere, just to kind of make sure things went as the Congress had passed them as far as passing the amendments. They also had to draft a new constitution and allow all males the right to vote within that constitution. That is the plan that actually was passed and voted on, and that's what we went through with, the Congress's radical Republican plan. Number 4, how were black codes used to restrict the rights and opportunities of freedmen? Well, first of all, let's list a few of these black codes, which are very similar to the slave codes. They couldn't gather in groups, especially after dark. No owning or carrying a weapon. Couldn't serve on a jury. At that time, there was no voting for them. Can't learn to read and write. They did not want them educated. That was kind of like giving them ammunition. They could better themselves if they had an education. They couldn't rent land. So basically, black codes were just another loop around in holding the slaves in their current position, holding them in that bondage. It continued to provide cheap labor for the cash crops, the plantation farmers, and keep slaves in their current position. Number 5, How did President Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans come into conflict with each other? Well, that's a funny way of saying it. It was almost war between the two, but they were in conflict always with each other. And discuss the Tenure of Office Act and President Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Johnson felt, because he was a Southerner, he felt that the radical Reconstruction plan was a little too harsh on the South. So when Congress passed it, or proposed it rather, he vetoed it. Remember our checks and balances. That's one branch keeping the other one in check, or not allowing them too much power. So what did Congress do as a result? They overrode his veto and passed the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Tenure of Office Act was created to limit his power. It basically said that he could not remove anyone from the cabinet without Congress's approval. So, how does he react to the Tenure of Office Act being passed against him? He goes in and fires the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. And from that action, the House of Representatives, Congress, impeached him. So he is our first president to be impeached. Now, let's review what happens when you're impeached as a president. Are you leaving office immediately? No. You are basically accused of maybe abusing your power. So the House of Representatives impeach a president, but then it goes to the Senate, and the trial will actually decide if he is to be removed from office or not. He was saved by the Senate by one vote and therefore continued in office. Sounds like our current president, right? Donald Trump. So 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Basically, I want you to remember this short way of remembering it. Freed citizens vote. The 13th Amendment freed all slaves. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation had started that process by freeing slaves in rebellious states. However, this took care of all territory. The 14th Amendment gave all freedmen citizenships. That's citizens' rights. And the 15th Amendment gave all citizens the right to vote. Not women, not yet. We're in the 1900s before that occurs. But that's basically called suffrage. So, how do you remember these three? Just remember this little short: freed citizens vote. Freed citizens vote. Okay, number 7. Explain the significance of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as a group. Basically, they all have one main origin, dealing with slavery, the issue of slavery. And that basically is the moral purpose of the Civil War. So they're all dealing directly with the moral purpose, which is slavery, of the Civil War. Number 8, how is the Tennessee Constitution of 1870 significant? Up until the 1870 new Constitution, the radical Republicans were pretty much in charge, making changes in the South. The conservative Democrats took over and dominated. They started to wipe out many of those changes that the radical Republicans had made. This is where they create ways to stop the slaves from getting full rights, which I'm going to kind of skip this because it actually goes with the next number 9, which is: what right did the Tennessee Constitution of 1870 establish for all men? It gave them suffrage, the right to vote. However, how did they limit it? How did they stop them? People they didn't want to vote? Well, they created a poll tax, which is simply where they had to pay a tax in order to vote. Most slaves were working in cotton fields, tobacco fields, rice fields, indigo fields. They didn't have money to go pay in order to vote. So it kept them from actually using freedoms that were given to them. They also created a literacy test, which held them from voting as well. A literacy test, when you go to vote, they would ask you to read certain questions. They might ask you, if they really were strict and didn't want you to vote, they might ask you to read the whole test. Slaves were not educated, and therefore it was another tool used to keep them in that slavery position and hold them.